and third graders. Today we are going to jump back into our colonial America lessons. We are on lesson 3 today, Jamestown and the Powhatan. Powhatan. We're going to learn a lot of fun stuff about the Native Americans and their interactions with the English settlers of Jamestown. Not necessarily the best time period, but we're going to go in there. It's fun. I love it. So let's look at some vocabulary words for you to amend. This means to change or add to. You hear that a lot when it comes to amending laws or changing rules or plans, making amendments to a plan. Anxiously or nervously, cautiously, consequently, therefore happening as a result of something else. So consequences of your actions. Destined or headed for, planned, destiny, determination, kind of thing. Devoured, ate, consumed, taken in, or taken over. Sparingly, conservatively, or carefully. So using your supplies sparingly means being careful not to use everything all at once. Squabbling is fighting noisily over something that is not very important. I get that a lot around here with my children. Starving time. That is a time in history when the colonists of Jamestown were dying because they were starving. There was a lack of food. Okay, remembers what the 3 ships on which the English sailed to America to start the first permanent English colony? What are those 3 ships? The Discovery, the Susan Constant, and the Godspeed. And we remember Godspeed means good luck. I am the king who charted the colony of Jamestown. Who am I? King James I, that's right. I am the investment company that was given permission by King James I to establish the Jamestown colony. What am I? The Virginia Company of London. Very good. I am the region in which Jamestown and the present-day state of Virginia are located. What region am I? Southern region. Good. I am the name given to the river near where the English established the Jamestown colony. What river am I? Remember, he likes to name everything after himself. The James River. There you go. We are the Native American tribe that were living in the area the English called Jamestown. Who are we? Powhatan. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Forgive me. When Captain Newport returned to England for much-needed supplies, I quickly realized that I and my fellow settlers needed a plan to prepare for the upcoming colder winter months. Captain John Smith. We're going to learn more about him today. See, Captain John Smith was hardworking and organized. Many historians believe that without him, Jamestown would not have survived. When John Smith finally took charge of the settlement, he did not beat around the bush. Smith introduced a very direct rule: only those who work would eat. As you can imagine, Smith was not very popular with everyone, especially the wealthy young adventurers who had never worked a day in their lives. John Smith knew it would be a huge challenge for the settlers to survive the cold winter months. As the weeks went by, Smith urged everyone to work on the construction of Jamestown, to gather fruits and berries, to fish, to hunt, to use sparingly or very carefully the little food they had stored. Now, to beat around the bush means that you hint at something instead of saying exactly what you were thinking. And I am very proud of all of the people who responded to my question about what you would do if you got to the new colonies. All of you pretty much said start farming, start building houses. None of you said go look for gold and silver. Awesome. So that was the problem John Smith had with his settlers, is they were trying to go look for stuff. They were trying to get wealthy. They didn't want to sit there and actually build up their camps. Okay. There are several different accounts of what happened during this time. One very well-known story, which you may have heard, tells how when the cold winter months came, many of John Smith's fellow settlers were sick and starving to death. John Smith set off to hunt and to persuade the Powhatan to give them food. According to this account, which some might call a legend, Smith was captured by the Powhatan warriors, taken to their chief because they wanted to kill the man who was leading the foreigners. Then, as the story goes, just moments away from Smith's death, the chief's young daughter, Pocahontas, or Matohaka, begged her father to spare Smith. The chief agreed to his daughter's request, and Smith was released. There's that picture of what's going on. I'm guessing that's Pocahontas right there. She would have been very young during that time. Chief Powhatan's daughter is commonly known today as Pocahontas, but her given name was Matohaka. She became known by another name in her life. Listen to find out what that other name by which Pocahontas became known. Many historians believe this may be a romanticized version of what happened. They believe that Powhatan did not actually intend to kill John Smith. Instead, he wanted to adopt Smith into the Powhatan tribe. This common ritual in many Native American cultures involves the figurative killing of a person's identity in order to be reborn into a new identity. So these historians believe the Powhatan were going to figuratively kill John Smith's English identity so he could become a Powhatan. When Smith returned to the Jamestown settlement, the colonists had abandoned their work schedule. They were squabbling or arguing among themselves again. Snow was on the ground and their food supply was very low. So some were even spending their time foolishly searching for gold. Smith was not pleased. Instead, he immediately set to work hunting and fishing and doing what he could to persuade his cold, hungry, disheartened companions that all was not lost. So instead of doing what they should have been doing, building their settlement, trying to get food and everything, they were off trying to find gold, which is good once you're ready to do that. But they were not ready for that yet. Now, do you think the young girl, any young girl, such as Pocahontas, would have been able to persuade her father, the chief, to change his mind? I mean, think about that. Could he really have done that? It's a possibility, maybe. Depends on their relationship. Then one day, a small band of Powhatan, led by Pocahontas, appeared out of the forest, having taken pity on this bunch of disorganized foreigners. The Powhatan brought with them much-needed food. Pocahontas and the members of the Powhatan tribe returned many times with food and general aid or help. They also taught the English new hunting and farming techniques. The food the Powhatan provided was enough to keep the English alive until help from their homeland arrived. That help came in January 1608 when Captain Newport's ship, the Susan Constant, arrived laden with food and more than 100 new settlers. Needless to say, the Powhatan were not happy to see that more strangers were coming to live on the land they inhabited. For a while, the situation improved. Seemed to. With more food to eat, they had energy to work. With more men, they had more hands to construct much-needed homes. Then tragedy struck. Somehow, and it is not certain how, a fire broke out. The fierce flames quickly devoured many of the buildings, as well as some of the food supply and clothes. You can imagine how devastating or upsetting this was for the settlers. The English had no choice but to start again. Fortunately, by this time, the weather was getting warmer. The Powhatan had taught them how to grow corn, which they called maize. Now that the weather was better, the Native Americans helped them once again by supplying the English with more food. Under John Smith's supervision, the men set to work rebuilding their homes, planting corn, and learning how to live in this new land. When spring came, Captain Newport, that's not the right, that was from last time. We're done with Captain Newport. Oh, no, we're not, never mind. Sorry. When spring came, Captain Newport set sail again for England. Some historians have written that the colonists who had been wasting their time searching for gold persuaded Captain Newport to load his ship with large amounts of red-colored dirt to bring with him. Okay? So, King James waiting for gold from the colonies. Okay? The gold-hungry colonists were certain that tiny pieces of gold could be found once the dirt was properly examined in England. However, no gold was found. It seems Captain Newport transported nothing more than a shipload of dirt across the Atlantic Ocean. Dirt. Yeah. Okay. Captain Newport returned to Jamestown again in the fall. The English colonists were happy to see him again. This time Newport brought more supplies, as well as 70 men and 2 women. 2 women. One woman, Mrs. Thomas Forrest, was the wife of one of the men on board. The other was her maid, Anne Burris. They were the first 2 women to live in Jamestown. Some of the other new settlers were from Poland and Germany. They brought a skill of glassmaking to the colony. By this time, John Smith had been elected president of the colony, and he was consistently enforcing this rule: all must work if they wanted to eat. Okay, I even got a chart on my refrigerator now listing all the things that my kids do around the house. Not that I would not let them eat, but it's just kind of interesting to see who's doing what. It's a good idea to do. John Smith was very, very serious, though, in his day. In fact, he actually said, "He that gathereth not every day as much as I do, the next day shall be set beyond the river and be banished from the fort as a drone until he amend his conditions or starve." In other words, he either figure out how to live better or apologize and come back. The word drone is often used to describe someone who is lazy or who does not work. A drone is a type of bee that does not help to gather food and is often fed by worker bees. When food becomes scarce, drones are forced out of the hive to starve. So John Smith was basically pretty harsh. Under John Smith's leadership, the colony began to prosper. Smith continued to establish fairly good relations with the Powhatan Indians. The two communities even began to trade with each other. The settlers traded beads and copper for food. However, 2 years after Jamestown was established, John Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion. Without medical assistance, his wounds would not heal. Smith was forced to return to England. The man chosen to lead the colony in his absence was George Percy. Unfortunately, Percy was not as good a leader as Smith had been. However, to be fair, he did have a challenge on his hands from the moment he arrived. After Smith left the Powhatan, they seem to have changed their heart regarding their opinion of their neighbors. Right? Now, what do you think a change of heart means? Is that their whole mindset changed. Their feelings toward the settlers was suddenly different because John Smith was gone. John Smith was their mediator, their go-between between these strangers on their land and them. So yeah, and prospering means doing well. That's what the colony was doing during John Smith's time there. Now, without John Smith there to actively promote friendship and trade between the Native Americans and colonists, relations between them began to suffer. The Powhatan no longer had someone they felt they could trust within the colony, and they became wary of the colonists. They began to raid Jamestown and steal essential supplies, especially food. They fought with the English settlers, killing some of them. In addition, the English settlers, without John Smith there to enforce his rules, did not manage their food supplies as carefully as they should have. Then once again, part of the settlement caught fire. So yeah, everything was just going up in smoke, literally. This time, the Powhatan refused to help the English settlers. Settlers waited anxiously for a ship that was due to arrive with supplies, but no ship appeared on the horizon. The winter of 1909 to 1610 became known as the starving time because the colonists ran out of food and many of them died. Finally, one spring day, 2 ships were spotted. They were the Patience and Deliverance. The settlers who had survived ran to the banks of the James River in eager anticipation. Both ships had been badly damaged at sea and just barely made it to Virginia. The ships were low on supplies. The settlers begged to be taken back to England, and the 2 captains agreed. Their patience is the ability to wait without complaining, and deliverance is the state of being saved or set free. So they literally were, they had to be patient waiting for these ships, and then they were delivered by the ships. But it gets better. Perhaps the most incredible part of the story is what happens next. Just as the surviving settlers turned their backs on Jamestown and set sail for England, they spotted the advance party of Englishmen sailing toward them. The retreating settlers were immediately informed that Lord de la Warr was close behind. Lord de la Warr was appointed by King James to serve as governor or leader of Jamestown. Lord de la Warr, it seems, had saved the day. Well, the entire settlement, actually. He had 3 ships. He had led 3 ships across the Atlantic, filled to the brim with Englishmen supplies destined for Jamestown. The Powhatan must have been horrified to see the settlers return. Okay, they're standing on the beach, watching all these strangers leave finally, and they're celebrating. And then suddenly they turn around and realize not just them are coming back, but even more ships are coming back. Like, I'd be a little bit disturbed by that. Even worse, there were more of them. Fortunately for the settlers, Lord de la Warr turned out to be a good leader. He restored a sense of order in Jamestown. Under his leadership, the buildings were repaired, Food supplies were efficiently managed. However, Lord de la Warr did not reach out to the Powhatan, as John Smith did. Things in England were changing, and the instructions to Jamestown from the Virginia Company of London was to stop trading and relying upon nearby Native Americans. They were told not to rely on people outside, but just do the things that they could with their own. Not really wise, but there you go. Over the next several years, more and more skilled settlers made their way to Virginia. Eventually, in 1619, the first shipload of women arrived. Colonists began to raise families in this English colony. Although gold was not discovered, something just as valuable was. In time, a settler named John Rolfe began to establish a relationship with the Powhatan once again. Guided by the Powhatan and under the supervision of John Rolfe, the settlers began to grow tobacco. About this time, smoking tobacco, which is very common now, was still very bad for you, and it was starting to become common in Europe. And we'll see here in a minute that even King James knew that smoking was bad for you, but he didn't care if it made him money. There were some important developments that took place in 1619. Now that things were going quite well in the English colonies, the English government felt comfortable allowing the colonists to make some rules of their own. That was as long as the colonists remembered who was really in charge. Good idea, right? On July 30th, 1619, the first lawmaking assembly gathered in the Virginia House of Burgess. Members of the House of Burgess were chosen to represent the areas of the colony of Virginia. Of course, only men could be chosen. But the House of Burgess would eventually pave the way for self-government and ultimately independence. It was during another period of conflict between the Powhatan and the settlers that the Powhatan kidnapped some of the settlers and took several firearms or guns. In response, the settlers kidnapped Pocahontas. This is what gets me. Pocahontas' father was willing to return the kidnapped settlers in exchange for his daughter, but not the guns, not the firearms. Keep my daughter, I keep your firearms. In response, the settlers refused to let her go. Consequently, or as a result, Pocahontas spent quite a bit of time in the English settlement, several years, in fact. During this time, Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married. Unlike the Disney movie with the Pocahontas title, completely inaccurate, but whatever. Still like it. Anyway, John Rolfe and Pocahontas were married and had a son named Thomas. During this time, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca. She and John Rolfe traveled together to England. They were guests in the court of King James. Sadly, just as Pocahontas and John Rolfe were preparing to return to Virginia, she became very ill. She died on March 21st, 1617, more than 300 years ago, at the age of 22. So she was pretty young, and she was buried in England. Later in the last years of his life, John Smith spoke of Pocahontas and said that without her help and the help of the Powhatan, Jamestown would never have survived. Perhaps this colony should have been given a different name, right? What name do you think it should have been given? Probably not King James, since he didn't do a whole lot to help, really. Well, he did send Lord Delaware, but... So we learned about Jamestown today, and that colony is located in the southern area. And the colonists initially took charge. That would have been John Smith. What role did he play? One of the original English settlers didn't beat around the bush and said that if you did not work, you do not deserve to eat. Right. Okay, some more questions for you about how the Native Americans and the English got together and how they got along. Not very well once John Smith was no longer there. This just tells you to learn to be good to your neighbors because they are going to help you survive. In difficult times, we do need to reach out to other people. It's not something we need to just stay in our own little bubble. The Native Americans were not happy with the settlers being there. The settlers didn't do themselves any favors by not having a good relationship with them, though. So they also faced a lot of challenges in farming and needing to get through the starving time. That was the winter of 1609 to 1610, dealing with survival. Patience and deliverance came from England, and they were saved. Patience meaning waiting for something without complaining. Deliverance meaning being set free. Let you go ahead and read through the rest of these questions. And the question I'm going to ask you is about the survival of Jamestown John Smith and Pocahontas. That'll be in your discussion post. Remember to pay attention to all the questions, and remember that Virginia was founded in 1607. You have a good day, my third graders. Don't forget to be awesome.